Arriving in a new country. When I landed in Australia in early 2019, I felt a mix of emotions: excitement, anxiety, and a little bit of fear. This was a new country, a fresh start, and a chance to build a future for myself. But I had no idea just how difficult it would be. Before coming here, I had to show proof of $10,000 in my bank account just to secure my student visa. It was a huge amount for me, but I managed to arrange it with my family's support. At the time, I thought the hard part was over. I had my visa, my university admission, and a plan in mind. But once I arrived, reality hit me like a storm. The struggle to find accommodation. One of my first and biggest challenges was finding a place to live. I wanted to live near my university, so I wouldn't have to travel long distances every day. But when I started looking for rentals, I was shocked. The prices were insanely high. Every place I found was either way over my budget or already taken by other international students. I would spend hours browsing rental websites, sending inquiries, attending inspections, only to realize that the demand was too high and I was competing with dozens of students for a single room. Days passed and I was getting desperate. I even considered sharing a room with strangers just to lower the rent, but even that was expensive. After what felt like endless searching, I finally found a small place in Carnegie. The only downside? It was 1 hour away from my university by public transport. I didn't have a choice. It was the only place I could afford. My daily routine as an international student, once I settled into my accommodation, my real struggles began. Every morning, my day would start before sunrise. 5:30 a.m., my alarm would go off and I'd force myself out of bed, still feeling exhausted from the previous day. 6 a.m., a quick breakfast. Usually just bread and tea because I was trying to save money on groceries. 6:30 a.m., I'd leave my house, walk 15 minutes to the nearest train station and catch a packed train to the city. 7:30 a.m., arrive at the university and attend my lectures, trying to stay focused despite the exhaustion. 6 p.m., lunch break, but instead of eating at the university cafe, I'd usually bring a homemade meal, simple rice and lentils, because eating out was too expensive. 2 p.m., 5 p.m., more classes, more assignments, more stress. 6 p.m., commute back home often feeling completely drained. 7 p.m., cook dinner, study for a few hours, then prepare for another long day ahead. Every single day felt like a marathon. The long commute, the financial stress, the pressure of keeping up with my studies. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. The job hunt and financial struggles. As if that wasn't enough, I also had another major problem: finding a job. In Australia, international students are only allowed to work 20 hours per week, but getting even a part-time job was a struggle because I had little to no work experience. I printed out dozens of resumes and went door to door, applying at cafes, restaurants and shops. Anywhere that would take me. But everywhere I went, I was met with rejections. "Sorry, we need someone with experience. We're not hiring right now. We'll keep your resume on file, but we can't promise anything." I remember walking for hours under the hot sun, knocking on doors, getting turned away over and over again. The worst part? I was running out of money. My aunt had generously covered my tuition fees, but my rent, groceries, transport and daily expenses, that was all on me. I started cutting costs wherever I could, skipping meals, limiting my transport expenses, and avoiding unnecessary spending. There were nights when I went to bed hungry, just so I could make my savings last longer. Finding a way to survive after months of struggling, I had an idea. I decided to offer math tutoring. I had always been good at math, so I posted an ad on Gumtree, hoping someone would reach out. At first, I wasn't expecting much, but to my surprise, students actually responded. Teaching math became my lifeline. I wasn't earning much, but it was enough to cover my groceries and public transport card. For rent, I still had to rely on family support and my scholarship, but at least I wasn't completely drowning. The emotional toll of studying abroad, even though I was managing my expenses, another challenge slowly crept in. Loneliness. Being in a new country, away from family, with no real support system, it was tough. I watched other students going out, having fun, living their best lives, while I was constantly worrying about money, my studies, and my next tutoring session. I remember sitting alone in my tiny room thinking, is this really worth it? Am I really going to make it? Some nights I'd call my family just to hear their voices, just to feel like I wasn't alone. Then, COVID-19 hit. Just when I thought things were getting better, the the world changed overnight. In early 2020, COVID-19 hit. Suddenly, the university went online. My tutoring students disappeared. I lost my only source of income. Australia went into lockdown and I was stuck, completely alone. No job, no income, no way to go home. I had to make the toughest choices of my life. The world changed overnight. I still remember the exact moment I realized that life would never be the same. It was early 2020 and there had been whispers about a virus spreading. At first it felt distant, something happening somewhere else, something that wouldn't affect me directly. But then, suddenly, it was here. Within days, the world around me started shutting down. The news was flooded with reports of rising cases, government restrictions, and lockdown measures. Universities announced that all courses would be moving online, businesses started closing their doors, people were losing jobs. One day, I was waking up early, catching the train, attending my lectures, meeting with classmates. The next, I was stuck inside my tiny rented room, staring at a laptop screen for hours, trying to process the fact that I had no idea what would happen next. At first, I told myself it would only be temporary, a few weeks, maybe a month. But as time passed, I began to understand the reality. This was not going away anytime soon. The isolation of online learning, adjusting to online learning, was far more difficult than I expected. I had always been someone who thrived in a structured environment. Waking up early, getting dressed, commuting to campus. These small routines gave me a sense of purpose. Now all of that was gone. My daily schedule became an endless cycle of waking up, rolling out of bed, opening my laptop, attending virtual lectures, and then closing my laptop again, only to repeat the same thing the next day. There was no physical connection with my classmates, no real conversations, no sense of engagement. Just a screen filled with muted microphones and blank expressions. Sometimes professors would ask a question, and the silence that followed felt unbearable. It was as if we had all collectively lost the energy to interact. I felt disconnected, not just from university life, but from the world itself. Days blurred into nights, and weeks passed without me even realizing. I lost track of time. The isolation began to take a toll on my mental health. I missed human interaction. I missed casual conversations in hallways, the sound of people talking in lecture halls, the feeling of being part of something. Instead, I felt like I was trapped in a bubble, completely cut off from the life I had once known. Losing my students and financial struggles before the pandemic, tutoring had been my primary source of income. It wasn't much, but it allowed me to cover my groceries and transport. When everything moved online, I hoped I could continue teaching my students through Zoom sessions, but I quickly realized that many of them could no longer afford tutoring. Families were struggling, cutting costs wherever they could. Others simply didn't find online learning effective and dropped out. One by one, my students disappeared. My earnings dropped drastically. For the first time since arriving in Australia, I felt real fear. How was I going to survive? University assistance, not enough to survive. My university offered some support to international students, mainly in the form of food assistance. They handed out basic supplies: rice, pasta, canned food, things that could last for weeks. I was grateful, but it wasn't enough. There were times when I had to stretch a single bag of rice for almost 2 weeks. I learned to ration my meals carefully, eating smaller portions just to make the food last longer. There were nights when I went to bed hungry, telling myself that it was temporary, that things would get better. But deep down, I knew I had no idea when that would be. Desperate for a job, in a time when people were losing theirs, with my tutoring income nearly gone, I had no choice but to look for another job. But how do you find work when businesses are shutting down and people are getting laid off? I applied everywhere: retail stores, supermarkets, fast food restaurants. The few places that were hiring gave priority to locals or those with experience. I spent hours every day sending out applications, refreshing job boards, checking emails. I walked around different neighborhoods, handing out my resume, hoping that someone, anyone, would give me a chance. Days passed, then weeks, and still nothing. I started to wonder if I would ever find work. The desperation grew stronger with each rejection. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I received a call from a poultry farm, the poultry farm scam. The job listing had said admin assistant. It sounded like something manageable, maybe answering calls, handling paperwork, organizing schedules. It wasn't ideal, but at that point I would have taken anything. I arrived at the farm, hopeful but cautious. The first thing that struck me was how different it looked from what I had imagined. Instead of an office, I was taken to a cold storage facility filled with stacks of raw chicken. The manager handed me a phone and a list of numbers. "Here," he said, "call these companies and sell our chicken pieces to them." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't admin work, this was cold calling, sales, something I had never done before. I asked about my role, my contract, my salary. The answers were vague. The manager kept brushing aside my questions, telling me, "We'll talk about it later." But after just 2 days I realized the truth. They had never planned on keeping me. They had only hired me to cover for an employee who was on leave. As soon as that person returned, I would be out. There was no future here, no stability, just false promises. On the third day, I walked out. I felt defeated, exhausted, and angry. But deep down, I knew I had made the right decision. Finding a warehouse job. Finally, some stability. That same day, I got a call from a warehouse I had applied to weeks earlier. They wanted me to come in for an interview. I barely had the energy to go, but I pushed myself. I had no other options. The interview was straightforward. The job was physically demanding. Lifting heavy boxes, working long shifts, standing for hours. It was exhausting. But when they offered me the position, I didn't hesitate. For the first time in months, I had a stable job. It wasn't easy. Every muscle in my body ached after my shifts. I was constantly tired. But at least I was earning. At least I could afford food again. Pushing through the darkness life was still far from easy. The isolation, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, it never really went away. I still felt lonely. I still missed home. I still worried about the future. But through all the struggles, something inside me refused to give up. I had made it this far. I had survived the worst of it. And that was enough to keep me going. The road ahead, the pandemic tested me in ways I never imagined. It forced me to adapt, to struggle, to fight for every little thing. But looking back now, I realize it also made me stronger. I learned how to survive when everything seemed impossible. I learned how to keep going even when there was no clear path ahead. And most importantly, I learnt that no matter how dark things get, there is always a way forward. Would I ever want to go through it again? No. But did it shape me into a stronger person? Absolutely. And for that, I am grateful. Coming up next, the battle to keep up with university studies. Just when I thought I had figured out how to survive, juggling a warehouse job, budgeting every cent, and dealing with the isolation of lockdown, another battle was waiting for me, keeping up with university studies. Online learning was nothing like I had expected. Lectures felt disconnected, assignments piled up faster than I could handle, and without a proper study environment, focusing became a daily struggle. But the real pressure? My scholarship. Losing it wasn't an option. It was one of the few things keeping me financially stable. But between working exhausting shifts, coming home late, and barely getting a few hours of sleep, my grades started slipping. There were nights I stared at my laptop, drained, unable to type a single word. Days when I felt like I was falling behind, drowning in deadlines with no way out. So, how did I manage? Did I keep my scholarship? Or did the pressure finally break me? Stay tuned for the next part of my journey, where I reveal the hardest academic struggles I faced, the sacrifices I had to make, and how I found a way to push through.